Okay, off we go. Well, welcome to this second webinar, as Roland said. So this is covering step 1 in the ethical AI framework for business in particular. The framework is the same, but we're pulling out examples that are particularly relevant to businesses. So how's it going to go? I'm going to talk through some slides for about 20 minutes, then take some questions. And then I'm going to have a conversation with Tom Hooper, who's founder and CEO at Third Space Learning, for about 20 minutes to talk through some very practical examples of this idea about looking at your business through a data lens and then thinking how AI can help you to understand what's happening more. Then a bit of time for a few more questions and some final input from me. And particular thanks for coming along to this on such a beautiful day outside. Maybe some of you are listening outside. I hope that's possible. That certainly would be great. So what I'm going to cover today is the basics of AI with particular reference to examples from educational applications. I'm going to explain why data is so important to modern AI, and I'm going to try and prompt you to look at yourself and your business through a data and AI lens so that you can develop an AI mindset. And I want to finally explain why an AI mindset is so important for education businesses. And the team, as I said in our first webinar, is Carmel Kent, Ali Chowdhury, Mutlu Kukarova, myself, Anisa Mweni, and Ben Deboulay. All of us have an expertise, experience in data science or AI and education. And this is the AI Readiness Ethical 7-Step Framework that I introduced in the first webinar. And today we're really focusing on that first step, which is about helping people understand some of the basics of AI and trying to show how AI can be of benefit to you, your business, your community, so that you can enthuse and excite your staff, your team, your business about engaging with AI and in particular data. So the basics of AI in 10 minutes, it's quite a challenge. We can think about AI according to many, many different definitions. And as I said in this first webinar, there are lots and lots of different definitions of AI, and there's a lot of disagreement amongst researchers and experts about what the right definition of AI is. But I think for our purposes, the simple definition is absolutely fine. We can think of AI as technologies that are capable of action behaviors that if they were being done by humans, we would perceive to require intelligence. And they're being used all of the time. We use them as we navigate cities, as we search on the internet, as we go through the automatic passport gates at airports, and there's lots and lots of educational applications of AI, increasing all the time. But where did it all start? Well, robots and AI are often considered in the same sentence or even thought to be synonymous. Now, of course, they're not. Not all robots use AI and not all AI is robot. But I thought I'd look to see where robots started from, where the word came from. And the first use of the word that I could find was in this play written by the Czech playwright Karel Čapek, which was very much about a dystopian future full of these robotic creatures that were bringing, ills to the world. But what I find interesting about this photo from the play is it's actually really hard to tell the difference between the robots and the humans. And I think that's a real warning to us that we need to be very, very careful that we don't mix up our artificial and our human intelligence, and that we take care to respect the differences, and in particular to recognize the wonderful richness of human intelligence in comparison to artificial intelligence. But modern AI really began about 63 years ago, when a 10-person group of academics got together at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire to study the processes of intelligence. And they had this idea that every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence could in principle be so precisely described that a machine could be made to simulate it. And they really felt that in this 2-month summer period, the 10 of them could make significant advances. Now, of course, that seems ridiculous now, but at the time, they really believed this, largely because they underestimated how complex intelligence is. And a couple of other really important events and people like Norbert Wiener, who's the forefather of cybernetics, who studied control and communication in the animal kingdom and then tried to use that to build machines, which is very much what modern robotics is built upon. And then, of course, Alan Turing, the famous mathematician who helped with code breaking in the Second World War, who had this notion of a computer being deserving of being called intelligent if it could deceive a human into believing that it was human. And this is what's known as the Turing test. And there are still today academics and geeky people like me who get together and have competitions around the Turing test. So it's not something just in history, it's something that's still ongoing today as people try and pit their machines against those of their colleagues. Now, a very early example of AI can be found in the 60s in a system built by Joseph Weizenbaum called ELIZA. Now, ELIZA was a very old-fashioned system. It was playing the part of a psychotherapist. And if I was sitting at the terminal computer and typing in, I might ask the psychotherapist a question. And you can see in this dialogue, the person who's sitting at the desk typing into the ELIZA interface has said, "I have a terrible headache." And ELIZA's responded by saying, "Well, maybe you should consult a doctor of medicine. I'm a psychotherapist." And so the dialogue goes on. And this kind of dialogue is based on a set of rules that use pattern matching. So the system looks for something that it recognizes in what's been said that it can match to the start of a rule. And if you look at the end of the dialogue, the person sitting in my position says, "Now you're just talking nonsense." And Eliza replies, "What makes you believe now I am just talking nonsense?" And that might have occurred because there's a rule in Eliza's rule base that says something like, if you match the pattern, in this instance, now you're just talking nonsense, then the response from Eliza is, "What makes you believe that I am?" And we can see it on the screen, "What makes you believe that now I am just talking nonsense?" So in this example, Eliza falls over very quickly. But in actual fact, many people were duped into believing that Eliza was human and was a psychotherapist and sat there and had interactions with Eliza. And indeed, many expert systems in the 80s were built on this principle of having a rule base that could be searched and used to do things like medical diagnosis. And these systems were useful up until a point. But one of the major problems with them was the fact that you had to write all the rules in advance. You had to give the computer all of its knowledge base of rules and then let it go off. And if you wanted to add to it, you had to go back into the program code and write it again, because unlike humans, these systems couldn't learn. And there were some great examples early in the days of AI in education. This early system in the 70s, exploring how we can create rules about how young children learn how to do addition, including buggy rules, and the system was called Buggy. So the creators, John Seeley Brown and Richard Burton, were looking to create not just legitimate rules for addition, but also buggy rules that would help to explain where a child was going wrong and how the system could correct them. And indeed, there were many early examples of AI in education that used this rule-based approach, particularly intelligent tutoring systems like the one you can see on the screen, which is a very dense interface with lots of text, not very user-friendly, but a system that was relatively intelligent in terms of its understanding of maths. And it was based on the principle that many intelligent tutoring systems were, where you had a so-called domain model or module that was the set of rules that described, in this instance, parts of the mathematics curriculum, a model or a module that described the learner, in other words, what the machine could interpret from the learner's behaviors that they understood about maths, a pedagogical model that had some rules about how teaching needs to be done, an interface, and the student. And many of these systems have been the forerunners of successful commercial systems, such as those produced by Carnegie Learning. But some of the real game-changing moments during the early days of AI, and now to the end of the last century, were the moment when the IBM machine Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov, the chess grandmaster. And this was a phenomenally important moment. I remember I was studying at university at this time, and people were really excited that we had a machine that could beat the grandmaster of chess, and thought, well, intelligent people play chess. If we can build a machine that can play chess, hey, we've got chess cracked, we've got intelligence cracked. But actually, it wasn't long before we realized that something like vision that we tend to take for granted is much, much harder to build a system to be able to do than chess. But nevertheless, the IBM machine was very successful, and it was indeed based on a set of rules, very much as I've shown you. But really, for modern AI, which is what we're talking about in this AI readiness course, the game-changing moment was the moment when AlphaGo, built by Google DeepMind, beat Lee Sedol, the world Go champion. And this was a system that wasn't based on rules. This was a system that learned from experience, from playing again and again and again against itself, a game of Go. But a very important point about this victory. Yes, AlphaGo may have won the game of Go, but my understanding is that the game of Go isn't just about getting the best score. It's about the relationships you form with other people as you play. And I suspect AlphaGo formed no relationships as it played. So maybe not quite as successful as a human Go player if we add to the context of playing the game, the importance of forming relationships. Now, 4 concepts that are very important to AI: autonomy and activity, the first 2. These are made a great amount of in a course called Elements of AI that's been developed by some Finnish researchers, which I'd recommend to anybody who wants to understand a bit more about AI. It's a very good basic course. Now, autonomy is the ability to perform tasks in complex environments without constant guidance. So we think about an autonomous car. Adaptivity, the ability to improve through learning from experience, which is precisely what we want our AI to do. But then we also need to think about narrow AI versus artificial general intelligence. Now, most of the systems that we have today are what's called narrow AI. They handle one task. So they can play chess, or they can diagnose an illness, drive a car, or recognize an image. If we think about a human who might be able to diagnose an illness, they can probably also play chess, drive a car, and recognize images. And that's what artificial general intelligence is trying to achieve. It's trying to build machines that can handle any number of intellectual activities, as we do, not just the one. So is that possible? I don't personally believe so, but many researchers do. But I think we really have to remember the difference between artificial and human intelligence when we think about artificial general intelligence. And we need to remember that our own human intelligence is rich and varied in a way that none of our AI systems are at the moment. And just in the way that when we had a chess-playing computer, we underestimated how difficult vision was, I think we underestimate many of the different facets of our complex human intelligence. And as I said in the first webinar in this series, we have many, many rich, complex elements of our intelligence, and only some of them are available to AI. And we need to remember that. And certainly the best AI is the sort that blends the human and the artificial intelligence, so that the human intelligence is augmented and enriched by the AI. But why is data so important to modern AI? And why am I talking about being AI ready through understanding your data? Well, to really understand this, we need to just take a little step back for a moment to that good old-fashioned AI, as it's called, some of those very early systems, many of which were developed to test theories in very small, contained environments, particularly game-playing environments. And some of the early techniques were those that used search techniques, whereby you would take an environment, in this case, perhaps a game of noughts and crosses, and you would work out all the possible moves that could be made into what was called a state space, a space of all the possible states for that game. And then you would develop an algorithm or a process that would work through all of those states and understand which, at any moment in time, would be the best one for a player to make. But this takes a huge amount of memory and a huge amount of processing. So for example, in chess, if you just want to look ahead 2 moves, you would need to generate 1,225 possible states in order to be able to make a decision about which might be the best. And if you wanted to look 20 moves ahead, it's 2.7 quadrillion. And obviously that is a very large amount of states. So early researchers came up with different techniques to prune the different states that were available. But it was still a difficult problem to take beyond these small contained environments of games. As I've already pointed out, the other main technique used in early AI systems were rules. Rules like those in ELIZA, the kind of rule that might say something like, if Jane looks sad, then give her some praise. And there was even an idea that these kind of production rules, as they're called, could be the basis of human thought. And they were certainly the basis of some very good AI systems used in education. The basis for a set of cognitive tutors built by Carnegie Mellon University, which were the early relations of the current Carnegie Learning commercial systems that are available to provide adaptive instruction to students in areas like maths and science and language learning. And here's an example of a math system from this type of system with one of the production rules. And you can see how actually these production rules quite quickly get quite complex, even when we're just looking at how we can deal with some fractions and how we can add fractions. In order to describe what should happen at one moment in time, we end up with quite a complex rule there. So we have this, if there are no subgoals and F1 is one of the given fractions and F2 is the other given fraction and D1 is the denominator of F1 and D2 is the denominator of F2 and D1 is a multiple of D2, then set a subgoal to convert F2 to denominator D1 and set a subgoal to add F1 and the converted fraction. Now, that's a very long rule for a very small move in arithmetic. And indeed, it was quite a task to take an expert, in this instance, a maths expert, and try and elicit their knowledge and understanding and turn it into a set of production rules. And there were many fine systems built this way. But as I've already pointed out, these systems can't learn, they can't improve because they have to be written in advance. And they're not very good at dealing with uncertainty. But they do have the advantage that they're quite transparent. If we want to understand why the system's made a particular decision, we can look at the rules that have been fired that have led to that decision being made. But the limitations in those early systems, that they didn't learn and they couldn't deal with uncertainty, are really where data and modern machine learning AI comes in. Because we needed to create systems that didn't have to work everything out in advance and that could learn, and in particular could process data to learn from experience. And that's precisely what modern machine learning AI does. But I'm not going to deal with the many, many, many different types of machine learning that we have available to us today. We'll look at some of those in more detail in step 5 in webinar, the 5th webinar about the framework. But just to talk through a few very simple examples of what machine learning does. So we have many machine learning systems that are being trained in order that they can recognize a particular item in an image, maybe an aeroplane or a bird or an animal, a ship. And the way that these systems, these AI systems, learn to do this is by processing millions of images that contain one of these items, an aeroplane, for example, so that the machine can learn the pattern that makes up that aeroplane. And then when they're shown a novel image, they can decide whether that novel image is or is not an aeroplane or a deer or a dog. And the same thing goes for some of the speech to text systems that we use. I often use the voice memo on my phone. I speak into my phone and the text appears in front of me. And that system that enables that to happen is one that's been trained on many, many different instances of voices speaking words, so that it can recognize the patterns that make up the particular words that are converted into text for me to then read. And other machine learning examples are those that use images such as these of lung cancer, and the AI is trained on millions and millions of different images to recognize a tumor. And another very common use of machine learning is in categorizing things, whereby the system has to learn the pattern of data that can be categorized as an X or a Y or a Z. And these kinds of things are very useful. And it's a bit like thinking about the data that might be useful in these systems means that we need to think about what data perhaps we use when we're learning. And we obviously learn as we grow up. We listen to speech and we learn to talk. But a very simple example of how we use data is one coming from a game here. If we think about the popular card game Guess Who, where we're all dealt a set of cards and we have to try and guess the identity of the mystery card held by one of our opponents. We do that through asking questions. And in a way, that's collecting data. But an example that I really like, and this is one of the last things I'll say before I stop for some questions, is this example where the AI system was trained to try and recognize the faces of guests attending Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's wedding. Now, this was a system that was set up by Sky News, and it was a very difficult problem because nobody had the guest list. It wasn't released in advance. So the system had to be trained on a set of images of celebrities who Sky News believed probably would be invited to the wedding. And then, of course, they didn't know what angle they would be seeing these guests at. So they needed images taken from many different angles. And actually, on the day, it was very difficult to recognize the celebrities. And fortunately, the team had realized the system would not be perfect and may well recognize Prince Harry as Elton John or vice versa. And so the system did the processing, flagged up to a human who they thought they were seeing, was being seen through the camera, and the human, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. So it was a combination of man and machine, or human and machine, I should say, not to be sexist. So we can certainly build these systems, but they're often best when they're that combination of human and AI. And we can think of education examples. When we think about classification, we could build a system that can classify essays or assignments into grades. We can think about how speech recognition for students who find it difficult to use a mouse and a keyboard. And then we can ask ourselves the question, well, what kind of data do these systems need? So machine learning helps us to solve some of those problems that the early AI systems using search or production rules led to. And that's because these systems can learn. These systems can learn from data and they can deal with a certain amount of uncertainty. But also, unlike the early systems, you don't know what's happening. When a decision's made, you can't see the rules that have led to that decision, and therefore it's very difficult to know what's happened and very difficult to explain why a decision has been made to other people. So I'm going to stop for a minute and see if there are any questions. I'm going to ask Roland if there are any questions before I welcome Tom for a conversation about data in businesses that are concerned with education. Roland, are there any questions that you would like me to answer at this juncture?
Hi, Rose. No, we haven't had any questions through. Most of the text in the chat has actually been me just putting down like the elements of AI reference and stuff, the web address.
Fine, that's fine. I'm very happy.
Somebody's got a question.
Oh, okay. I'll wait.
Yeah. Lopa, so Lopa, do you want to type it in or do you want to ask it in person? Let's see if we can activate your mic for a sec. All right. Lopa, you should be able to talk. Oh, okay. Well, in the meantime, Alan has asked, as a personal development company empowering parents, sometimes fragile parents from disadvantaged families, how can AI help with soft skills?
Good question. There are certainly ways that AI can help with soft skills. One of the things that AI is very good at is crunching a lot of data that we would find very difficult as humans. And so what we can do with AI is use what I refer to as, and other people too refer to as, multimodal data. So data about the way somebody's moving or speaking, what they're saying, how they're interacting with other people, to interpret from that data the way that person might be feeling, or the way that they're socializing, or how effective they're being at working with other people to solve a problem. And that way we can flag up some of the characteristics, the skills, the abilities that need to be in place for those soft skills to be developed. And we can then feed back to human tutors, mentors, teachers, where they need to provide more support for a particular student or a group of students. And we've done quite a lot of work with collaborative problem solving, for example, and I can certainly send you, Alan, some references to that work if you're interested. But now, unless Roland tells me otherwise, I'm going to welcome Tom Hooper, because we want to think about how you look at a business through a data and AI lens. And as Tom runs an EdTech business, I thought it would be really interesting to bring him along to talk about the way that the kind of technology company that he runs and the sort of data that he does or does not come across, what he uses, the difficulties, the challenges. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to have a conversation with Tom. So Tom, do you want to tell us a little bit about your business first?
Yes, I shall. Rose, hello everyone. Rose, thank you for hosting this. Very kind of you. So I set Third Space up in 2013, and I think I've known Rose since 2013, there or thereabouts. So what we do is we provide online one-to-one maths teaching, almost entirely to children in schools as part of the school timetable. And the goal of the business is to make one-to-one teaching affordable and accessible to children in need. So the way we achieve that is by recruiting talent, kind of academic talent from across emerging markets, specifically India and Sri Lanka, where we have offices. And there's a significant population of STEM graduates. Undergrads, postgrads, mothers, people taking an additional job who we can recruit and provide really good training to and really good flexible job opportunities for. And then that allows us to provide online one-to-one teaching to children in primary schools as a part of the primary school timetable. The way we kind of define the business, we're not a marketplace, and this does lead into the point on data and AI, so it is quite an important point of difference. We're not a marketplace where a student picks the profile of a tutor. Students don't pick who their tutor is. We sell programs that teachers use to target children, mostly who are falling behind, and to direct at specific learning gaps that are causing them to fall behind. So we have a very structured curriculum model that allows us to diagnose what a child's needs are, create a personalized learning journey for them across that term, populate that journey with content, train the tutor to deliver that content, and track and report the progress of the student and the performance of the tutor, obviously to our academic teams in India and Sri Lanka, and the teacher in the school all over the UK, to help them understand both that they're getting good value for money, but also how is the child progressing in terms of the gaps that need to be filled. That's
so
what we do.
That sounds like you must have quite a lot of data coming in through that business. So can you say a bit about the kind of data that you have access to and the way that you use it in your business? And maybe sometimes it's difficult, maybe sometimes it's straightforward.
Yeah, of course. And probably I'll talk more about the challenges of using it. And I'll start with the kind of big aspiration that led me to Rose, and then I'll probably talk a bit more about the reality that has stopped me got in the way of me implementing that thus far. So when I first approached Rose, I said, look, this is what I want to do. This is what I think makes us different. And I said to her, what I think you will be interested in and what I think you can help me with is that we will be recording thousands of one-to-one interactions in a very structured way. So we'll understand the profiling of each participant and the training journey that the tutor goes on into and through that session, and the learning journey that the student goes on into and through that session, and at a conceptual level, what they're working on and interacting with. So if we can structure that correctly, can you help us to develop an intelligence that can quantify the value of those human interactions, and as a result help us to kind of augment the performance of that tutor? Which sounds lovely if you say it in 30 seconds, but reality is more challenging.
So what kind of, can you just say a bit about the kind of data that you could collect through that, so through the system that you had, and then move on to the challenges?
So I suppose at a headline level now, we've been doing this 6 years. So we've worked with over 60,000 children, and we've delivered over 700,000 hours of teaching. So at the top level, it's hundreds of thousands of hours of recordings of one-to-one interactions. If you then start to break those down, you've got what concepts were covered in that lesson. And I'll come back to the definition of concepts. What you've got a spoken interaction, how much speaking took place. You've got a level of tone, you've got interaction and interruption. You've got profiling of each of student and tutor before the session and post-session as well, which is very important, as well as how the concepts link into the content that is mapped to the curriculum. I suppose there's a third level where we do pre and post session assessments. We also do beginning and end of program assessment as well, to try and track the impact of the whole program and the impact of that session, to then try and quantify the performance of that tutor.
Fascinating. I mean, that's really interesting. On Tuesday, we did one of these webinars focused on schools and colleges and university, and we had a primary school head teacher talking about the way she used data. And she was saying about the complexity of dealing with the data that she had available to her as a head teacher, and how difficult it was to bring it all together. But that's kind of a drop in the ocean in comparison to the data that you've just described. So how were you looking at that data initially?
Probably too simplistically. So the challenge I put to kind of Rose and her team and our team was, I want us to be able to measure the attitude and attainment of each pupil. So it can't just be about the improvement in attainment. It has to be about attitude as well, because what we see time and time again is that confidence is the primary impact of teacher to student, a human to human, and confidence, particularly for children that are falling behind, is the foundation for improvements in attainment. So I wanted to be able to measure confidence as the kind of primary goal, which then was broken down into the kind of effective, cognitive, metacognitive. And so it was trying to look at how do we measure them. The challenge then is, which I think I'll say in two ways. One is understanding that you can talk about AI, then you've got to have the data for the AI, but you've also, or critically, you've got to have the user experience to capture the data in the right way in the first place. And I'll give you two very simple examples within the school environment. What we see a lot is children will end the session with the tutor at the end of their lesson within the school timetable and then leave, which means that they don't complete the post-session quiz. If they don't complete the post-session quiz, you don't get the data. So you can build this model that says, okay, this is what a child will do, this is the data we'll capture, this is how it will start to inform the outputs from the human interactions within the session. And that's great as a model, but if your user experience and your real life user environment don't allow you to capture that data is completely irrelevant. I'll give you another example, actually, which I only realized the other day when the team were talking to me about it, that when we were asking, it's all online, obviously, asking students the questions, we would say, did you guess this answer? Did you know this answer? Or, and can you give your workings? And anyway, when we actually watched children do this, we realized that what we intended to get, which was a way of understanding the confidence level and logic behind a multiple choice question, we actually found that it was having quite the opposite effect. And children who didn't know it, well, basically, we were getting the kind of inverse answers. So the data was totally skewed based on a child's understanding and motivation in terms of their interaction with the system. And those sorts of things take a lot of time to implement, watch and observe, change. So just have the base level of interaction to capture the data, to figure out if the data is correct before you can do any of the AI, takes a long time.
And that's really fascinating. They're great examples because it shows how we can't make assumptions that the data we think we're going to collect is necessarily going to be the data that we do collect, because it's all about that interaction, isn't it? And also that just because a system is online, and I think this is particularly important given the current situation where so much more online learning is happening, doesn't mean that it's somehow easy to collect and identify the data. So there's some real challenges. But what do you feel that as a business have been benefits to you from taking so much time to look at yourself, if you like, through this data lens? What do you feel it hasn't or hasn't worked well for you as a business?
Yeah, so it's a good time to ask that, because I have wondered whether we, and I say we as a team, and this must come from me, overcomplicated our approach to this goal, this ambition, by kind of biting off this big aspiration. And I think we could definitely have been accused of that. However, I think the view internally is that whilst we probably overreached in terms of some of our goals, had we not done that, some of the critical thinking and structures and experiences that will be essential to achieving this would not have been in place. And I say that even at the simplest level with it, if I refer back to how I introduced us, we're a platform with a kind of curriculum architecture at its heart that the tutor and the student and the parent and the teacher are all working through, and not a marketplace. Like fundamental decisions like that are critical to allow you to work through the mistakes and realize how you do it. And we're going through a process now this summer of kind of re-architecting that curriculum to make the learning objectives that each student and tutor work through much more granular, so that we can try and avoid, or at least adapt much more quickly to exactly the sorts of opportunities and challenges I mentioned about capturing good information per learning objective, ensuring that what we test the child on is what they need to learn and have learned, ensuring that the feedback we give to the tutor is based on the actual concepts they're delivering. So it personalizes kind of symmetrically. And even though we've known we need to do that for a while, I think it's been a necessary process of mistakes to have gone through to feel really confident that the plan the kind of next iterations will be, well, I'm sure they won't be correct, but they'll be much closer to the ambitions we've got than we are today, and more efficiently achieved.
Data-driven iteration of innovation, which I find really interesting. And it sounds as if, maybe you didn't have the right data to start off with, but without having collected that, you wouldn't have been able to work out what the key questions and the key challenges that you were going to address next might be.
Yeah.
So last question before I throw it open to anybody in the audience who would like to ask a question. If you were, talking to an entrepreneur who was just setting up their business, what would you say to them about data collection? Would you advise them to try and look at the data, to pinpoint things, to work with it, even if sometimes it feels like it's quite difficult? What would you say to them that you feel is something that's valuable about looking at your business through a sort of data lens?
So one of the things that springs to my mind is something that a data scientist who we had employed for a few months said to me, which I'd never thought of, which I think slightly come through in what I said about. She said, you cannot think of data science in any of its usages in isolation to product design, and therefore kind of product design and customer experience. She said her use of data is only as good as the data captured.
Yeah.
And the use of her data science capability is only as valuable as the ability to relay that back to and influence the user. And it sounds really obvious to say that, but I just was like, yeah, that's absolutely true. And you're not, I hadn't given her the ability to influence the roadmap. And so it's as much, how do you structure your team? How do you structure the team, and how do you build that into the fabric of product experience, product design, and what you want to achieve? It can't be a bolt-on, and it's very easy, particularly in a startup environment, for it to be this sort of nice thing that you talk about, but in reality it's kind of in the corner because you're fighting fires and trying to sell and trying to get customers on board, and you just don't have the bandwidth to properly architect and properly design for such purposes.
That's fascinating. That I can really relate to. I think that's very interesting. Thank you, Tom. That was so good, so useful. Roland, is there anybody who would like to ask Tom or myself a question?
Yes. So the question originally from Lopa, which we didn't answer, was in a human AI model, is there not an iterative effect to help increase the speed at which AI learns, so that ultimately the human can step out of the exercise?
That is a brilliant question, Lopa. There could be, technically, yes, but that's an area where we need to be really careful, because I think there are three important issues here. There is the way in which in learning environments, we use what we understand about human learning to inform the way that we analyze the data. In other words, how we design those machine learning algorithms. Because although we recognize that AI has made leaps and bounds in the last 20 years, what we forget is that, or sometimes we forget, is that at the same time, in parallel, our understanding of human learning has increased enormously. So first we need to do that. And then second, we need to obviously make sure that the algorithm learns effectively. As you say, it learns effectively, it gets better and better and better. But where does the human machine learning decision making stop, start, and join? I think we need to be very careful about deciding, not just because it looks as if the AI has learned enough to be able to make the decision on its own. We need to think carefully about whether we feel comfortable with that decision being made without some kind of human input, particularly since, as I've said, it's very hard to know what the machine learning algorithm is doing because it's not transparent. And so, for example, we might feel quite happy with an AI algorithm crunching lots and lots of different data sources, maybe some voice and some facial data, something, what somebody's writing, and coming to a conclusion that there's evidence to suggest that this person is, for example, developing a good understanding of a particular part of the history curriculum, for example. But would we not then want the human to still be in the loop when a decision's made about what might then happen with that student? Or we might be happy for the AI to decide what particular activity the student might want to do next. But when it got to bigger decisions, I think we might still want the human to come back into the loop. So I think, yes, it's possible for the AI algorithms to learn and improve and get much more accurate, but that doesn't necessarily mean we still don't want a human to be somewhere in that decision-making loop. What we need to do is work out where that point is. And I think personally that needs to be a decision that's made by the joint processing of AI and human, until the human feels happy that the AI is genuinely reliable enough that they can take a little step back and then pop in again sometimes to make sure everything's okay.
Can I ask you an example of that,
yes.
Rose, from what we spoke about?
Please, Tom, yes.
So currently, we have, well, they're called different things in different places, but we have team leaders effectively who watch one of their tutors' sessions every week or fortnight, and they score it against effectively a common framework to help us track, give them professional development and track their progress. And one of the things that we kind of intended to do or intend to do is that as we can overlay more intelligence, and to start with, that's just like better kind of information processes, the kind of ratio of human oversight of those recordings would increase or decrease, I suppose is actually the way of saying it. So we never really foresaw that we'd get to a point where we didn't do any human observation of the sessions. But if we could have a level of intelligence within the platform that could start to take the pressure off those human observers, so they were more sort of guiding the algorithm rather than actually watching hours and hours of sessions, it makes the feedback loop to the tutor much, much quicker. And we can have a high degree of confidence in its accuracy, ideally feedback for every single session they do. It makes the human observation time far lower and far more efficient, and it allows the kind of human and algorithm to work far better in practice for both people's benefit.
Brilliant. I think that probably targeted more very much what Lopa was interested in, looking about her comment about efficiency and efficacy. Roland, any more questions?
Yeah, just the one. So I think this is sort of related to the classroom level. Veronique has asked, could emotion recognition on the face of children be a possible indicator of the level of their confidence?
Shall I start that one and then hand over to you, Tom? I mean, yes, technically, we know that using AI, we can do a pretty good job at interpreting emotions on the faces of learners, provided the data about faces is combined with audio data. Really looking at facial data on its own, the accuracy is not that great, but when you combine facial data and audio data, it becomes much more accurate. Of course, there are lots of ethical problems with that, but technically, yes. But Tom, over to you. What do you think about that in your system? How would you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose putting the ethical bit aside, and actually the emotion, well, ethics, emotion, the same thing. I doubt people would be happy with that happening in the classroom. We don't use video, like face-to-face video. We only use audio, so we don't have any experience of this. I suppose from our point of view, we kind of triangulate tutor voice input, student voice input, and then the kind of conceptual level of the curriculum. So I suppose I illustrate that as ideally you would be triangulating between a few different correlated sources of data rather than the single one of, in this case, the face. I say that based on how we do it and kind of how simplistically I think of it, rather than having ever actually done this. So I would defer to Rose's answer, but certainly that's how we would look at it, and I would understand it.
Definitely multiple data sources help. I mean, we've found over the times that we've used different types of data sources, that the AI models that we can build are far more accurate when you've got a good combination of different types of data. So that triangulation is really important. I agree. Sadly, I need to say goodbye to Tom for now to get back to finish off the session on time. But thank you, Tom, for joining us. That was brilliant.
Bye, everyone.
Just
and
what we
thank you,
needed.
Rose, for including me. Very kind of you.
Absolute pleasure. I shall share my screen again.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye. Oops, sorry, it's taking some time. But we've had the questions that you can see. Oh, why is it not appearing? Oh, sorry, I've got the spinning pizza wheel of doom on my Mac, which means it's going to take a few minutes for this to happen. So I'm just going to talk as you can look at my rather frozen screen, but that's okay. So we've had the question session, and the next thing I was going to do was just really try and finish up by telling you exactly why I think developing an AI mindset is so important for businesses. So there are huge implications that AI brings to education, and we can think of them in three particular categories. We can think about how we can use AI to tackle some of the big challenges in education, particularly around those gaps between the more able, the less able, more privileged, less privileged. There's also the way that we need to educate people about AI so that they can use it safely and effectively. And there's also the way that we need to think about the implications of AI more generally in the world for the way that we educate people, and particularly for the way that we need to focus on those rich elements of human intelligence that we can't automate. And these aren't mutually exclusive implications. They're highly connected. If we do better in one, we'll probably improve in the others, and we need to improve and link, improve and link. And that's very much at the heart of what we do at Educate Ventures. We build on this notion of the Golden Triangle, which is all about helping to develop the community, the ecosystem. The 3 points of the triangle are represented by the people who are building educational technology, like Tom, people who research it, like myself and the team, and the educators and learners who are using the technologies, like Carrie, who joined us on Tuesday. And it's about bringing that community together. And the gold is the evidence and the data. And it's about bringing that community together around data and evidence. Because in that way, then we can use AI more wisely. We can change education systems in a way that's driven by data. And we can help people understand AI in a research and evidence informed way. And that triangle can sit at the heart of the way that we achieve this cycle of the actions and the categories of actions that need to take place. And in particular, what we favor and what we support is this building of co-design partnerships between stakeholders, so that we have educators and trainers who understandably don't understand much about AI. Why would they? Working with those who are building AI systems who probably don't understand much about teaching and learning. Again, why would they? It's not their expertise. But researchers with a background both in education and AI can help to build the right collaborative relationships between those two communities around this focus on data and evidence, and driving forward decisions that are evidence and data based through looking at businesses and the way that we apply EdTech, particularly that uses AI within the school system, the education system, even outside of school, in the home, wherever learning is happening. And if we get these groups working together, we end up with educators understanding much more about AI, AI developers understanding much more about education, and we end up with more evidence-informed product development and application. So we get better products, we get better application of those products, and we end up with more knowledgeable communities that can continue to work together to constantly improve what is available and how it's used in education. And that's very much where we can help. Now, I'm going to ask some questions just in case there are any final questions. We've got just a few minutes left, which is how I like to leave it. So there's a chance for a final question or two, and then I'll just recap what the next activity will be in terms of the webinar, what the next webinar will be as we move forward. So Roland, are there any questions that I can answer finally before we close?
None at the moment, Rose, but perhaps now that we've announced it, we might get one in a minute. But
okay, well, I will go through the final slide and then we can come back if there's a minute or two left, and if there are any questions, we can answer them.
Sure.
So, as I've said, this is the second in a series of webinars. The first webinar was an introductory webinar that didn't differentiate between those that were designed for people working in schools, colleges, universities, and those for people working in educational businesses. But now we've differentiated. So we did our first educator one on Tuesday. This is our first business one, and we'll now continue fortnightly. So the next one for business will be a fortnight today on Thursday. I think that's the 4th of June.
Yeah.
At this time.
Yeah.
Thank you, Roland. And so we'll continue along this. We'll be doing step 2 in the 7-stage ethical AI framework, and it'll be a very similar format to today. There'll be some content that I'll go through, some conversation, an opportunity to ask questions. There is a recording of just the slides with a voiceover from me that lasts about 30 minutes, available from a website. And there'll also be available a video of today's session as well. Am I correct in saying that, Roland? I better just check in with you.
Yeah. So the bite-sized version is on the website, and the full recording will be going up on YouTube, and both are linked in the chat. And
that gives you an opportunity to also take in the conversation between Tom and myself, which obviously isn't there in just the version with the slides and the audio. Right, we have 2 minutes left. Are there any questions, Roland, that have appeared?
Yes, just one. Aisha has asked, is there a way of using AI-based solutions for teachers working in deep rural communities of developing countries where there is no internet connectivity?
Oh, that's a brilliant question. And such a challenge. I had a project several years ago in Africa in an area where there was no electricity, let alone any internet connectivity. We had to use solar power, charging, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, without internet connectivity, we can't have a system that is connected to the internet, but you can still have AI systems that run without the need for that connection. Now, they can't do as much as the systems that can be connected to the internet, but nevertheless, it's absolutely possible. Indeed, many of the early AI systems were built before the internet existed. In fact, the system that I built as part of my PhD was never connected to the internet. And no, it wasn't machine learning, well, not really anyway, but it certainly was providing an adaptive experience for learners. So absolutely, you can have AI without the internet. But people designing it need to recognize that's a constraint when they start and work out ways around that so that you are enabling people to get the benefits, maybe not in such a wide variety and not using such large data sets perhaps, but certainly, yes, you can apply some AI systems. But perhaps more importantly than actually applying the AI technology is that you can apply the AI thinking, the data thinking, learning from data, and perhaps some of that learning with that data can be processed in an environment where there is access to the internet. But nevertheless, you can still use those AI techniques to understand that data, even without internet connectivity. So not having the internet does not rule out AI altogether. It limits it, but it doesn't rule it out. Great question. Thank you so much for asking it. And thank you to everybody for joining us today. Back to you, Roland.
That is it for the time being, Rose. Thank you very much for your
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody. Thanks for joining us.